All right, let's get right into it. We're going to be talking about the final, absolutely brutal chapter of World War II. And of course, the terrifying new weapon that didn't just end the war, it changed the course of human history. Forever.
And that leads us to the big question, right? The one people have been debating for decades. Was it actually necessary? In this explainer, we're really going to dig into that. Was dropping the bomb a purely military decision? Or was there something else, something much more complex, going on? So, to even wrap our heads around this decision, we've got to go back to 1945. You have to remember, the war in Europe, that was done. But the fight in the Pacific, oh man, it was just this incredibly grueling, bloody slog, inching closer and closer to Japan itself. So, how did we even get to this point? Well, after the shock of Pearl Harbor, Japan was just dominating the Pacific. The real turning point came at the Battle of Midway in '42. That was Japan's first major naval loss in 100 years. But, that wasn't the end of it. What followed was this slow, brutal, island-by-island advance that took years and cost so many lives just to get American forces within striking distance of Japan. This strategy had a name: island hopping. And the idea was pretty clever, really. Instead of trying to take every single island, which would have been a nightmare, the plan was to bypass the really heavily fortified ones. You just grab the most strategic islands, like stepping stones, to create a path, a runway, basically, to get your bombers close enough to launch attacks on Japan, and, hopefully, bomb them into surrendering. And I really can't stress this enough. The sheer brutality of this war was on another level. This quote here from Admiral William Halsey, it's shocking, but it really captures the intense, racially charged hatred that defined so much of the fighting in the Pacific. And that was true on both sides. And look, this hatred wasn't coming from nowhere. It was fueled by some truly horrific events. Back home, Americans were hearing these awful stories from things like the Bataan Death March. And then, later on, you have the kamikaze attacks, which, to the Americans, seemed to prove that the Japanese were just totally irrational. All of this was cranked up to 11 by propaganda that painted Japanese soldiers as uncivilized, barbaric, sometimes not even human. And the human cost of this island hopping was just staggering. Let's just take one battle, Okinawa, right at the end of the war. The Japanese lost over 100,000 soldiers defending that one island. 100,000. And for the Americans, it was a bloodbath too. We're talking 17,000 killed, another 36,000 wounded. I mean, after a single battle like that, you can see why leaders were desperately looking for any other way to end the war. And that alternative, well, it was being built in total secrecy, out in the middle of the New Mexico desert. So let's shift gears and talk about the Manhattan Project, because this is where that new weapon was born. Just look at the numbers here. The scale of this thing is mind-blowing. We're talking 150,000 people working on this, a cost of $2 billion back then. That's like, what, over $30 billion today? It was this massive scientific and industrial undertaking, all focused on one single goal, and they pulled it off in July 1945 with the very first successful atomic test. So, okay, the weapon works. Now comes this absolutely terrifying new question. Where do you use it? And the process for picking a target, it was just chillingly strategic. Planners were looking for cities that had some kind of military value, sure, but they were also looking for cities with lots of densely packed wooden buildings, specifically to make the fire damage as bad as it could possibly be. And that cold, hard calculation, it led them to 2 cities. Now we turn to the moment these weapons were actually used and the unbelievable human cost that came with it. So on the morning of August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber called the Enola Gay flew over the city of Hiroshima. It was an important communications and supply center for the Japanese army, and it dropped the very first atomic bomb, a weapon they called Little Boy. And what happened next was, well, it was hell on earth. The blast literally melted stone and metal. The survivor accounts from that day are just harrowing. People remember seeing a blinding flash of light and then unimaginable destruction. These personal stories, they really bring home the reality of that moment in a way that just listing statistics never, ever could. The final death toll is almost impossible to comprehend. An estimated 140,000 people. Think about that. About half of them died instantly in the blast. The other half, they suffered agonizing deaths over the next days, weeks, and months from terrible radiation sickness. You'd think after something like that, it would be over, right? But even after this incredible devastation, Japan's government didn't immediately surrender. So just 3 days later, President Truman gave the order to use a second bomb. And here's a crazy detail that just shows you how much of history comes down to pure chance. The original target was a city called Kokura, but on that particular morning, it was cloudy. The bomber couldn't see the target, so it flew on to the secondary target, Nagasaki. An entire city's fate was literally decided by the weather. So in Nagasaki, which was a big industrial center and a major seaport, the horror was repeated. At least 60,000 more people were killed. That brings the total death toll from just 2 bombs to well over 200,000 people. Well, the 2 bombs did what they were intended to do. After Nagasaki was destroyed, the end of the war and the fall of the entire Japanese empire came very, very quickly. But it's really important to understand something here. While the atomic bombs were obviously a huge, decisive factor, they weren't the only thing happening. You see, Japan's leaders, they already knew the war was lost. Their cities were being flattened by regular bombs, their armies were defeated, and, this is critical, the Soviet Union had just declared war on them. So the bomb on Nagasaki, you can think of it as the final, devastating straw that broke the camel's back. It's what finally pushed Emperor Hirohito to step in himself and say, okay, it's over. And all of this brings us right back to where we started, to that central question. Because for decades, historians have been arguing about the real reason President Truman decided to use these weapons. And it really breaks down into 2 main arguments. On one hand, you have the view that it was purely a military necessity, right? The goal was simply to avoid that horrific, bloody invasion of Japan and save what could have been 250,000 American lives. But then there's the other argument, that it was a political move, a power play, a way to end the war before the Soviets could get involved in Japan, and maybe more importantly, to send a really strong message to a guy who was becoming a problem, Joseph Stalin. Whatever the real reason was, the end of the war created a brand new world almost overnight. Suddenly, Japan was occupied by the US, Germany was carved up between the Allies and the Soviets, Korea, which had been a Japanese colony, was split in 2 right at the 38th parallel. And of course, the United Nations was created. The end of this massive global war immediately set the stage for the next one. And that leaves us with one last, kind of chilling thought to chew on. If the bomb on Hiroshima was meant to end World War II, what was the bomb on Nagasaki really for? Was it just the final, terrible act of one war? Or was it the opening shot of the next one? It's a question that, honestly, we're still wrestling with today.